My name is Harding Bush. I'm the security manager at Global Rescue. I'm not a professional medical provider, but that's okay because most people that deliver first aid aren't. The most important thing about first aid is to have some first aid training, either specific to a wilderness environment like a wilderness first aid course or any sort of Red Cross first aid course that you might have had in the Boy Scouts or swimming lessons. Those are all good. We're going to talk specifically about wilderness first aid kits. We're going to talk about what needs to be in a personal or what should be in a personal first aid kit. And we're going to ensure that planning that first aid kit, that what you have in that first aid kit matches what you may likely run into. Basically, the things in the first aid have to match for the duration and location of your first aid kit. And a lot of that is the remoteness of your location or how far away the nearest medical professionals are. First aid can be basically categorized into three areas. While giving first aid, it's essential that you maintain an airway so the patient can breathe. Next category would be controlling the bleeding. This is all sorts of bleeding, from the minor cut all the way up to the arterial bleed that you need to treat with a tourniquet. The last category would be the ability to immobilize a joint or a fracture by the use of some sort of splint, to immobilize that to keep the patient comfortable before the emergency providers arrive. Another critical point of first aid has always been the ability to treat for shock. However, when you control the bleeding, when you immobilize the fracture, when you're treating the injury, you are actually treating for shock. You're actually reducing the likelihood that shock is going to become a factor before the emergency providers arrive. So let's look at some things that are actually in your first aid kit. Now, this is the start of the universal kit, not necessarily specific to a region. This is stuff that should be in every first aid kit. First thing you should have are safety gloves to prevent you from getting any bodily fluids, blood, anything like that, and making you sick. It's very important to have antiseptic ointment such as Neosporin, bacitracin, alcohol wipes in order to clean any of the wounds or any of the areas that you're treating. Okay, let's talk about control of bleeding. Bandages. All sizes of Band-Aids are always important. Butterfly closures, standard Band-Aids, larger Band-Aids, and then anything more than that, you're going to have to put a pressure dressing on. That means you're going to have some sort of gauze to go over the wound, and then to wrap that gauze. That is what's known as a bandage. There are pre-packaged pressure dressings that are ready to go. They have the gauze material along with the ACE-type material to wrap around that will create the direct pressure on the wound to stop and control the bleeding. It's always important to have some kind of ACE wrap. This is good when putting bandages on a wound and also when you begin to have to immobilize a joint or a fracture using a splint. Immobilizing joints or fractures. Not much you can do for these except to stabilize them to make the patient more comfortable until the emergency provider is done. That's done with splints. You can make a splint out of anything that you can find in the wilderness, basically. Trees, your ski pole, what have you. But there are pre-made splints that are ready to go that can be put into your first aid kit. They come in a package like this. They're a stiff, foldable foam. When they're open, they look like this, and you can see they're very stiff folding. And this, in conjunction with a triangular bandage or a cravat, comes in a package like this. And again, the ACE to help immobilize that splinting material. Some other important things to have in your first aid kit would be moleskin. Moleskin can be used to cover up blisters. You really have to know how to use it. Another important thing to have in there is some nutritional items for your injured patient. Things like Gatorade powder to give him some electrolytes, or a power bar. Those sort of things. Give him a little bit of nutrition, make him more comfortable, which will actually improve his time to recovery. One thing I've always learned, no matter where you are in the world, you can be cold, and a small emergency blanket is always an important thing to have in a first aid kit. It folds up very small, but it's very effective at retaining the patient's heat if he starts to become cold, which can be elevated because of the injury. One of the most life-saving items that as a first aid provider you may use in a first aid situation is a tourniquet. A tourniquet will restrict arteries and stop an arterial bleed. Arterial bleeds are life-threatening, and they are very likely life-threatening in the time before emergency providers arrive. Important things about a tourniquet is where you have it. You're going to need it so fast, you're going to recognize that arterial bleed, you need to get a tourniquet on. You don't want to have that tourniquet in your first aid kit buried in the bottom of your rucksack. When I was in the military, we always had our tourniquets on our top shoulder pocket. There's a lot of tourniquets available, and they're small, compact, so that you can put them anywhere. Have one in your first aid kit and have one in a top pocket, and make sure that everybody in your group knows where your tourniquet is. Effective planning is a very important piece of building your personal first aid kit for the wilderness. Just as you research the area that you're going into the wilderness, you have to think about what you're going to need in your first aid kit. And some of the factors that answer those questions are where you're going, how close medical resources are, how long you're going to be, and how many people in your group. As an example, for specific requirements due to the remoteness of the region you're going to be doing your activity in, let's look at Mount Washington in New Hampshire and Mount Katahdin in Maine. Very similar in height, very similar in required skills, but however, in Mount Washington, it's right off the highway. Emergency providers are going to be able to get to an injured person a lot faster, where in Mount Katahdin, it's much further away from any sort of emergency providers. So you're going to have, or you should have, a more extensive first aid kit in a situation like that. We talked about some of the specifics of a first aid kit dependent on where you're going. However, it's always good to just have a universal kit. That's your starting point. And then you can add to it for additional requirements. The pre-packaged, ready-to-go wilderness first aid kit are good, but like I said, they're a starting point. You need to know what's in them. You don't want to get familiar with that first aid kit while you're actually giving first aid. One mistake that some outdoor enthusiasts make when they're building their first aid kit is they forget about the little ouchies, the little bumps and scrapes. They have all the stuff for an arterial bleed and to treat a broken femur, but they don't have the things just to keep a simple cut clean and dressed. They don't have Band-Aids. Never forget the small stuff. You need the Band-Aids, you need the Neosporin, you need the chapstick, you need the sunscreen. Those are the sort of things that are more likely going to happen, and if they're not treated immediately, can escalate into a pretty bad situation. When you're building your first aid kit, when you're putting those items in, think of those categories of first aid that we spoke about. And everything in your first aid kit should be able to support one or more of those categories. Those categories are the ability to maintain an airway, control bleeding, all types of bleeding, from an arterial bleed right down to a little scrape on your toe, and ability to immobilize a joint or a fracture. So that's a lot about first aid kits. So in summary, first aid kits are part of your overall trip planning process. Think about where you're going, what are the requirements that you're going to have in that first aid kit, how long you're going for, how many people are in your group, and probably most importantly, how long will it take emergency providers to arrive at your location? To continue on with that thought, how are you going to contact those emergency providers? Who are you going to contact? And make sure it's written down in your notebook so when it comes time, you have the capability to contact them.